So, in a previous conversation, we talked about Graham Allison's conceptual models of foreign policy, and we sort of ended with this elite or bureaucratic politics model. And I'd like to maybe dig into that a little bit more and talk about some of the dynamics that go on with group decision making, and how that might play out in a bureaucratic politics situation or in just any group situation. So I'll start with just really basic definitions. Group is a collection of people, two or more, that's making a decision. This is the most common decision-making unit in foreign policy. It's very rare that a president is out there making a decision on his own or her own. Oftentimes, they're working with an informal group of advisors or a more formalized national security council kind of structure, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the course, or decisions are being made through congressional committees where legislation is being sort of workshopped and debated and discussed and amended. So there's lots of different ways that groups can play out in foreign policy, and it's worth understanding some of the dynamics of how they operate. And for a long time, this was called the collegiate model. It was argued that groups were the best way to solve problems and make decisions, because they would allow for many different perspectives to be brought to the table, that you would be able to debate the pros and cons, that the process of group interactions would produce a rational process that would maybe approximate the unitary rational actor model that we talked about. That idea that groups were sort of a solution to human bias, that groups were a reliable way to get good decisions, has really been called into question by social science research over the years. And I think it's fair to say that in practice, group decisions oftentimes fall short of that ideal of rational process and rational outcomes. And so we could think about groups as having a couple different types of outcomes. It might be that there's a dominant solution where everybody in the group agrees and quickly coalesce around an answer to a problem, or it could be gridlock, right? I mean, the group might just simply lock up and not be able to actually produce any sort of outcome. In both cases, maybe we have a single national decision, maybe that works. The group may not be fully rational. There may be some serious biases that affect the group dynamics. And we'll talk about this idea of groupthink, which is a specific type of bias that affects groups. And it might be that what emerges out of a group isn't necessarily the best rational decision, but something that results from horse trading, right? I don't like your solution, but if you give me something and we make a change in one direction that benefits me, I'll be willing to support this thing that I otherwise have reservations about. That might not be producing the best solution. That's creating a solution that can sort of get support from the group members by, it's called log rolling, essentially paying people off with concessions where they can strategically win support. So we talked a little bit about this idea of different kinds of outcomes. Folks who study group dynamics have noted 4 different kinds of outcomes that can emerge from group decision making. I don't have a whole lot to say about this, other than I think it's kind of useful to have a sense that groups can deadlock, right? There can be stalemate and you just can't find a solution. You can have that dominant solution, right? Everybody more or less agrees. One solution's put forward. There's group consensus. You can get a subset where you have a group of people who advocate for an option. That subset, that faction within the group, is able to successfully push that forward, and it triumphs maybe by majority vote, but there's strong dissent. And then sometimes you get creative solutions where you put forward a proposal, it gets refined, it gets modified, you sort of build support over it, over a process of iteration. Sometimes that process of iteration is positive in that it creates more effective and improved solutions, right? The initial proposal missed something. Through the conversation, we discovered that, and we found a way to address that other problem that we didn't anticipate. Sometimes it produces outcomes that are less beneficial because of that log rolling dynamic of I have a halfway decent solution, but in order to win your support, I have to tack something onto it that nobody would have supported otherwise. But adding in this additional piece gets the support that it needs to pass. Groupthink is one of these things that I think has sort of entered the sort of mainstream that people will talk about groupthink. But when it was developed by Irving Janis back in the 1970s, he was talking about a very specific kind of group dynamic. And so I want to make sure that we sort of have the official sort of social science understanding of what groupthink is and what it involves, so that maybe we can differentiate that from other kinds of group problems. Groups can be dysfunctional for a whole wide number of reasons that have nothing to do with groupthink. So this is not meant to encompass every kind of problem that groups have, but Irving Janis identified 3 different forms that he thought sort of reinforced 3 sort of biases, 3 sort of common dynamics that sort of reinforce the worst dynamics that groups can produce. And he said that as a result of that, of these 3 forms, you get a deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment that comes with group decision making. And when you really parse what he's saying we get stupider, we get delusional, and we get evil as a result of group dynamics. And I think it's worth talking through how that works. And so one of the things that happens is that when we are in a group, it is particularly elite groups, I think, particularly selective groups, it's really easy to overestimate the group's moral authority, the group's legitimacy, the group's power. When you look around the room and you see, these important people who are there, when you feel like that you have been tasked and given this authority, it can really foster a sense of sort of invulnerability, that we're going to make a decision and that decision will be right because we have the smartest people in the room here, because we've been given the authority to solve this problem. And that sense of invulnerability can encourage people to maybe put forward riskier proposals than they might otherwise if they were just sort of, pitching an idea to their boss. And then there can be that sense of sort of morality, that because we're a member of the group, because we hold this sort of elevated position, we're not necessarily responsible for our actions and for the consequences of what we recommend in the way that we would be if we were sort of individuals making this decision. We're sort of shielded from personal responsibility by the group. And when you sort of introduce that and you add it with a second form of groupthink, of closed-mindedness, you end up in some really dangerous situations, right? You have this collective effort to block out outside criticism. And so one of the things that will happen is that, particularly with this, and I'll add in this third piece as well, because I think they all kind of tie together, somebody will put forward a really terrible idea, again, because they're encouraged to take greater risks, because they feel insulated by the group. So somebody throws out a really terrible idea, and there's this pressure toward uniformity that I might think, wow, that's a really terrible idea. And then I think, but I don't want to tell this person that it's a terrible idea because that would be uncomfortable. And so I start looking around the room, waiting for somebody to shoot that idea down, and nobody speaks up. And suddenly I start thinking, well, gosh, there's a lot of smart people in this room, and nobody's speaking out and calling this idea out as, evil, stupid, and dangerous. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my initial concerns were ill-placed if everybody else seems to think that this is okay. And so bad ideas don't get challenged. And it can be because I don't want to rock the boat and I don't want to create uncomfortable situations. It might be because there are people within the group whose job it is to maintain the harmony of the group. We call them mind guards, who will try to protect the group and its coherence. And so if you do speak out and say, yeah, that's a really terrible idea, right? They pull you aside after the meeting and say, you really embarrassed, Susan with your criticism. You need to stop doing that. For our group to work, well together, you need to be more supportive. And then bad ideas are able to circulate, and they're allowed to circulate. And so that pressure to uniformity sort of builds. And then when you take your idea out to the rest of the world, you're going to encounter people who aren't as willing to sort of gloss over bad ideas, and they're going to criticize you, and they're going to criticize the group's decision. And then another sort of dynamic of groupthink comes in, which is sort of locking down and protecting the group, right? That you sort of react and you say, you weren't in those meetings. You are not the expert. You don't have the perspective. You don't have the vision. You weren't given this task. How dare you come and criticize what all of these smart, brilliant, hardworking people have done? Where do you get off? And you push back and you start attacking the motivations of people who are giving this criticism. You dismiss them as stupid or weak or evil or out to get you, and you create justifications to push that well-meaning and maybe well-grounded criticism away. And as a result, the group sort of hunkers down, and these dynamics sort of reinforce, and the group becomes more and more delusional, more and more disconnected from reality, more and more hostile to outside information. And you can sort of see how all of these pieces sort of reinforce each other to create a situation in which groups spiral in a direction that is really unstable and dangerous. Not every group goes down this road. I think that's worth pointing out. The groups can produce good outcomes, but this is a trap groups can fall into. And so I've got another slide that I'll load up for folks to discuss in a little bit. But I'm curious if you've seen this happen before. And if so, I'd really be curious to hear about your experiences with groupthink. I certainly have encountered it a time or two of my own. But also, what are strategies that a leader could take to possibly counteract this, to possibly prevent this from taking hold? And so I'd be curious if we could maybe just have a brainstorming conversation about what could prevent these three forms of groupthink from really spiraling in a group and poisoning the decision process.